Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another lecture in this year's series of London lectures, Remembering and Forgetting, brought to you by the Royal Institute of Philosophy. It's a great pleasure to have with us this evening our speaker of the week, Kathleen Higgins. Kathleen is a professor of philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin. She is well known for her work on Nietzsche, on aesthetics, especially the aesthetics of music, on non-Western philosophy, and on the philosophy of emotion. She is the recipient of many academic honors, including a fellowship at the Rockefeller Center at Bellagio, and the author of a number of monographs, including The Music Between Us, Is Music a Universal Language?, The Music of Our Lives, and most recently in 2024, The Aesthetics of Grief and Mourning, as well as a number of co-authored works with her late husband, Robert C. Solomon. And her subject this evening is Remembering the Dead. Kathleen, over to you.
When thinking about this topic, it occurred to me that usually we do talk about remembering the dead. We reassure people that we will remember them if they are close to us and facing death imminently. And I think this has been a long-standing practice among people. The sense that you're doing right by the dead to remember them, and that remembering them in some way is honoring them, seems to be a long-standing view. It also seems to be something that most of us would like to receive from our loved ones. So to quote the aforementioned Robert C. Solomon, he commented, "I have hope that my wife will remember me fondly, and that what she will remember about me will be a bottomless trove of quirks, habits, accomplishments, foibles, and shared experiences." And indeed, this is something that I think we describe almost as a pledge and put this on, for example, tombstones or memorial cards. The idea that we will keep the dead loved one in our heart, that they will always remain in our memories, seems to be standard fare for such things. And yet, and this is where I think it becomes more complicated, we might wonder if it really makes sense to pledge to remember someone, because we might not think we have a huge amount of control over our memories in the first place. I think this might be especially common in bereavement. For example, when we lose a loved one, it's not unusual to have memories just well up. If we happen to be in a position to be near the deceased shortly before they died, we might find ourselves having the events that led up to the death or events that happened immediately after just spring to mind. And I think this is frequently something that happens to people when they try to sleep at night. Insomnia is not unusual at all in bereavement, and unfortunately, memory can sometimes intensify the problem. Even more common, I think, is a phenomenon of having memories of a person simply come to mind almost at random. There's nothing sequential like the review of what happened before the person died and when you found out about it and so on. Instead, it seems that anything having to do with a person might pop into mind as among one's memories. Marcel Proust had his narrator have such an experience in his tome, Remembrances of Things Lost, and this is how his character thought about the fact that he had just discovered the loss, the death of a former lover of his named Albertine. "How could she have been dead to me when now, in order to think of her, I had at my disposal only those same images, one or the other of which I used to recall when she was alive, each one being associated with a particular moment. A little statuette as we drove to the island, a large, calm, coarsely grained face above the pianola. She was thus by turns rain-soaked and swift, provoking and diaphanous, motionless and smiling, an angel of music. Each of these was thus attached to a moment, to the date of which I found myself carried back when I saw again that particular Albertine. So great a wealth of memories, borrowed from the treasury of her life, such a profusion of sentiments evoking, implicating her life, seemed to make it incredible that Albertine should be dead. And I think there often is a sense of incredulity soon after a loved one has died, and the vividness of these memories that seem to come on their own kind of adds to that impression. Freud made a point of talking about this phenomenon of memories just kind of randomly welling up, and he seemed to find it to be important to the whole process of grieving and coming to grips with the situation. Now, he uses his scientific language to describe it, so he talks about each of the memories in his terms being hypercathected. Cathexis for him has to do with a lot of psychic energy going into something. And he describes our investment, as he puts it, into particular objects of love and affection in terms of cathexis. And what happens, as he describes it, is that every time one of these memories comes up, we add even more energy to it. It's as though, particularly because it has become poignant in the circumstance, we invest all the more energy in this context. But what happens is not a matter of remembrance, certainly not the kind of remembrance we would like to have from our loved ones. Instead, Freud describes this as a matter of testing the image, recognizing that it isn't really accurate of the current world, and letting that energy move along. So, to quote the way he talks about it, each single one of the memories and expectations in which the libido, this psychic energy, is bound to the object, is brought up and hypercathected, and detachment of the libido is accomplished in respect of it. I should mention that he thinks that each of these memories, in a way, has its own connection to us, that we are attached to each of the single memories. So in Proust's story, his character has a particular affection for Albertine playing the pianola, or Albertine on their way to an island where they vacationed. And each one of those needs to come up, Freud thinks, in order for us to test it against current reality and recognize, wait a minute, the person isn't here any longer. And therefore, it doesn't, in a sense, make sense to continue investing this kind of immediate energy in the person. He describes this in the second passage. Reality testing has shown that the loved object no longer exists, and it proceeds to demand that all libido should be withdrawn from its attachment to that object. Well, that's all well and good, but in a way, this is not memory in anything like the way we think we ought to be remembering the dead. If anything, it seems almost the opposite. I think, unfortunately, people tend to feel that their memories are not doing the loved one justice. And in fact, people can feel guilty about the way their memory is behaving in the context of a loss. This was brought home to me when I went to a memorial event that on my university campus is held once a year to honor all the people who are part of the university community who have died. And there was a special group that gathered of people who were members of the immediate families of these people. And one woman said that sometime after her husband had died, her adult daughters took her on a trip because they thought that would help her. And she said, and actually it was really wonderful to spend time with my daughters. And I had a really lovely time. And then I came home and felt as if I'd been unfaithful to my husband. And I think everybody in the room understood what she meant. It's not that this is a kind of rational response, of course, but I think that often, especially early in bereavement, we tend to feel that our mind should be so focused on the person and the loss that any other thing that comes in, especially something pleasant, is really a kind of betrayal. I think it's important to be realistic about memory, precisely because I think that given the already tremendous suffering of grief, it's unfortunate if we add to that by feeling that we ought to be able to remember in a way that memory just isn't designed to work. Just the idea of being conscious means that our attention is going to move around. And psychologists such as George Bonanno have studied grief and the kind of different emotions people feel in grief. And he's concluded that it's really important, even for grieving, that people sometimes, in a sense, come to the surface and pay attention to people around them. That if you were just constantly focused on grief and loss, that would be just psychologically so overwhelming that you wouldn't be able to constructively deal with it at all. Another kind of way in which people might berate themselves for their memories in loss, I think, is suggested by C.S. Lewis in his grief memoir, which he wrote after the death of his wife, whom he refers to as H in the context. Now, I should say that he wasn't primarily focusing on memory. He was focusing on all the many kinds of experiences he was having. And I don't think that he is directly blaming himself for this phenomenon. But it's pretty clear that he regrets the fact that he thinks inevitably his memories will fade. And I think many people are like him in this respect. So in his memoir, I think this is the point where he most focuses on it. He says, slowly, quietly, like snowflakes, like the small flakes that come when it's going to snow all night. Little flakes of me, my impressions, my selections, are settling down on the image of her. The real shape will be quite hidden in the end. 10 minutes, 10 seconds of the real H would correct this. And yet, even if those 10 seconds were allowed, 1 second later, the little flakes would begin to fall again. The rough, sharp, cleansing tang of her otherness is gone. He's pointing to, I think, a very real phenomenon that anyone who has grieved has experienced, that of starting to feel like your impression of the person isn't as sharp as you wish it were. Probably before we had recording technology available that's so readily available, or when cameras weren't available, people especially might feel that they didn't remember too well how the loved one looked. But I still hear people say, I'm not really sure I remember exactly the color of his eyes anymore. I think this is a very natural reaction too. But again, it's not something that people should berate themselves for. And in particular, I think in the context of feeling what kind of memory would do right by the dead, this isn't the kind of memory that is really at issue. For one thing, even if you could remember really, really well, nobody has a perfect memory, and everybody's memory does some constructing and putting together. At least that's what psychologists currently think about any memory at all. But also in the context of thinking about what kind of memory honors a beloved person, really it isn't a matter of absolute accuracy and sharpness. It's more an attitude, I think, that we have in mind, and a sense of orientation toward them. one of the reasons that the random memories that just well up don't seem to do justice to the deceased or to pay respect to the deceased is they aren't really connected with emotion or affection. And I think anyone who's thinking about remembering the person or holding them in one's heart is thinking about that kind of attitude instead. So I'm going to move on to talking about different kinds of memory. Here I'm going to draw on a book by Edward Casey, who wrote a book simply called Remembering. And I think it's useful for my purpose here because he draws attention to a lot of different things that we call remembering. And these various things, he notes, don't all have the same relationship to the different parts of time, past, present, and future. I think we often tend to think of memory as being mainly about being able to clearly see the past. But his suggestion is that this is an aspect of memory, but many kinds of memory that we have more to do with the present and the future, or at least as much to do with the present and the future as they do the past. And that's actually what I want to emphasize as well. Instead of thinking of remembering the dead as a matter of simply recreating with some clarity recollections of the past, the kinds of ways that memory can relate to affection and feeling and direction toward the future, I think is much more what people have in mind when they think of honoring someone with our memories. So these are various kinds of memory that Casey mentions, and I will discuss each of them in turn and then conclude with a special type of commemoration that is internalized, and I think especially important in these contexts. So first of all, Casey talks about reminiscences. And he points out that reminiscences actually don't even necessarily involve any kind of sharp, clear memory at all. Sometimes just getting together with someone that you knew from another part of your life inspires this state of reminiscing, and it isn't necessarily a particular occasion that you remember, though that might quickly come up. And the reason that it might come up is that reminiscences are very often sociable and verbal. This has a pretty clear relationship to the way in which we think about remembering the dead, in that frequently when people gather, especially in memorial events such as funerals, people often do talk about various memories they have of the deceased, and one might remind one of another. This, in fact, is something that sociologist Tony Walter has emphasized when talking about the value that this kind of informal conversing can have in contexts like gathering for a funeral or a memorial. And I found it interesting in his discussion how much he talks about the informal aspect of what is involved in this kind of reminiscing. Of course, we'll talk at some point about rituals, but this kind of informal discussion, he thinks, is really helpful to people who are reeling from a loss. I think particularly in the context where memories are just floating around and they don't necessarily feel that they have much control over them. But to talk with other people tends to stabilize an impression of the deceased. And that stabilizing of an impression makes it easier to focus your feelings toward the person, or to adjust to the absence of the person. As long as spontaneous memories are moving one around, and you might recall, a fight you had with the person and some other occasion, it's as though a lot of different images are accosting you, much as Freud and Proust seem to suggest. And by talking with other people, you get the impression that they knew the same person that you do, or that you did, and that this person has actually a kind of reality in the social world. So despite the person's absence, you share the same person that you are grieving for, and this remembering is something that helps everybody in some ways process the grief and direct their feeling toward at least a mental image that's rather stable. Another thing I think that is particularly beneficial in grief is that frequently, especially at a funeral, one is overwhelmed by the thought of the person's loss. But memories remind you of the person being active and alive and vital. And that's very comforting. It's kind of a mental way of reviving the person in a very happy and meaningful way in one's mind. A second kind of memory that has a role in connection with the deceased is reminders. And one of the things that Casey mentions about reminders is that actually they don't have that much to do with the past as such. I mean, they may, of course, you have to think about something and maybe want to remember something that you think you're going to forget. But the fear that you might forget something is really much more a focus on the future and doing something in the present to make sure that the future is what you want it to be. I would think that a lot of physical monumental memorials fall into this category. And Casey does too. He mentions, for example, some memorials are set up both to honor people who lived in the past, but to make their memory something important to us as we go forward and to future generations. But I think in a much more domestic way, reminders are also part of what's going on when we remember the dead. Now, this may seem an odd example, the fact that often family members of the deceased feel comfort in wearing the clothes of someone. I remember a friend of mine saying, you know, after my father died, I kept wearing his hat. And I said, yeah, that's very common. And he was quite amazed. But I think that this kind of physical reminder of the person having been present and something connected to them still being immediately present in our world is something that makes the present seem easier to navigate, and the comfort value of that is tremendous. And indeed, this sort of thing can make you bring to mind the person, can make you recall the person on a recurrent basis. But, and obviously tombstones do this too, but I think one thing about reminders that is worth noting is they have their limitations in terms of remembering the dead. Novelist Robert Musil made this comment, there's nothing in the world as invisible as a monument. And obviously, if that is the case, they're really not serving the function they're designed to serve. And I think what he has in mind is something like this. Now, this is a monument that I haven't seen in person, and I suspect that if I did go to this place on the Natchez Trace Parkway in the United States and saw this, I would pay attention to it. But if you walk by a memorial every day on your way to work, or you drive by a memorial every day, you stop noticing it. It just becomes another part of the environment. And I think this can happen in much more domestic spaces too. You might hang a picture expecting you're really going to enjoy seeing it, but after a while it just kind of fades into the background. And that can be true of images of the deceased as well. Pretty clearly, it's quite possible to overlook Post-it notes if you've ever used this way of reminding yourself to do things. Having one in a place you're not expecting to see it might remind you to do something. Having a lot of them, I think, very rarely does, at least in my experience. So reminders have their place, but they have their disadvantages too. Recognitions, I think, is another kind of memory that we might not even think of often as memory. If you recognize something, of course, there has to be something in the past that you're referring back to. But recognition, in the sense that Casey is using it, can be, as he puts it, instantaneous. It's like, oh, now I see. And I think this is something that funerals and other contexts do a very good job of enabling. What I have in mind is the kind of thing that philosopher Donald Kiefer described when he was talking about his mother's funeral. So I'll read this passage. For me, the most moving, awe-inspiring words during my mother's funeral were delivered, apparently off the cuff, by my nephew. He said, "My grandmother was the sort of person who would never sacrifice good taste for nutrition." It was funny in that Oscar Wilde sort of way. It was touching and true. Most of all, it captured metaphorically what she was all about. It was an epiphany. She was a she was a virtuoso of domesticity, an exemplar of making one's home a home for others. We all knew better through this wise comment what home should be and how in this corner of the galaxy it would never be the same. I like the fact that he touches in this comment on the kind of humorous aspect of recognition oftentimes. I think his idea is that when we have an experience of hearing something about a deceased loved one that is so in character, it brings a smile. And I think there's maybe perhaps some truth in the saying that everybody as an individual is a comic character. Just someone being themselves, when they do it with such unerring effortlessness, is a bit funny. And part of this, part of what I think is especially valuable about this is that you come to see the person in your mind's eye. And somebody else's description, especially when it's a description that sounds so apt for the person, enables us to do this. And I think perhaps it even makes us feel a certain intimacy with the person, that we recognize them so well. Again, I think this is a comforting phenomenon for many of us. A friend of mine died recently, and several people who knew her were talking about her and her recent death. And one person who had been to her apartment said that there were some people who were, because she lived alone, were tasked with packing up things that belonged to her and sending some to her sister and so on. And someone said, well, that will obviously be a lot of work. And a person said, well, it's not maybe so bad because Susan had things very well ordered. And everybody smiled because Susan was the kind of person that, of course, would have everything well ordered under any circumstances. And I think the smile in that kind of context, when you're talking with other people, maybe going back to Tony Walter's point, amplifies the impression of seeing the person, because you get the sense that we're all seeing that very person, and indeed that was what her character was like. I'll only briefly mention this type of memory. I think this is a type of memory that frequently has a kind of dual edge in bereavement, but I think it's worth pointing out. Casey talked about the way in which often our habits tend to bring a person to mind. And I think the reason that this can be the case is that frequently if we interact with a person on a somewhat regular basis, we do have habits that are designed with them in mind and that trip us up if we don't interact with the person when we expect to. In a way, I think body and place memory maybe go together. One maybe most often feels this sort of thing when you go to a place expecting to see someone and then they're not there. And that sense of their absence crushes you at that point. Or, as is not uncommon, sometimes you see someone in a distance and kind of expect it's going to be the loved one, even though you know the person has died. And then, of course, it's like, no, it cannot be. And that's really upsetting. I think that's a kind of mental habit of expecting to see a person that can be quite disturbing early on, as can the kinds of things that you do, like around the house, if you've lost someone that you live with, and you're kind of expecting the other person to do certain kind of things. Like, you suddenly discover, anywhere I set something, it's going to stay there forever unless I move it, or unless I get somebody to come in and move it. This kind of sense of it being a shared space becomes overwhelmingly unavailable when someone dies. I think in this respect, the kind of memory that Casey talks about here is often a very disturbing and upsetting one. However, I think that it reflects the fact that a loved one often is someone with whom we had such an intimate relationship that our very way of carrying ourselves in the world and our expectations as we proceed take them into account. And if the emphasis is placed on that intimacy, it has a kind of positive valence, which I think over time can come to predominate. But one of the reasons that I'm not going to dwell on this so much is I think the negative aspect of this kind of memory is maybe more salient at first, and the way in which it moves on to something else I will touch on again a bit later. The fifth kind of memory that Casey discusses are commemorations. And he talks about two kinds of commemorations, which I will talk about in turn. I think usually this term tends to be associated with ritual kind of events. So funerals, commemorative events, such as various kinds of memorial days that different societies might have to honor the dead, perhaps the dead, people who died in a war or in some accident or something like that. And one of the things that is important about these is that they tend to be social, but social in a way that allows a lot of room for personal reflection. So it has a combination, and I don't mean to act as though this isn't connected with the same sorts of gatherings where the informal conversation goes on. And certainly that can be very personal too. But commemorations have a different function, even though these two things might happen alongside each other. And commemorations, in one sense, are renewing memory. They're a kind of act in the present to maybe solidify memory, but also to call it up. So there's a sense of summoning of memory in a commemoration. Psychologist Nico Freida, who lost both his brother and his father in World War II, wrote about commemorations when he was well advanced in years. And being in Holland, one of the things that he focused on is the Remembrance Day that is held in the Netherlands I believe it's May 4th, and the entire country comes to a halt for a couple of minutes. I happened to be in Amsterdam when this happened one year, and the streetcars just suddenly stopped on a dime. And just this sense of the social magnification of focusing for 2 minutes on this moment of silence is very moving. And I think that's particularly what Freyde had in mind. So a commemoration that happens quite a while after the deceased have died. Among the things that he thinks is especially valuable here is that commemorations assert the objective importance of those who have died. So the way this can combine with personal loss and collective loss is that there's a kind of communal recognition of the event, which can be certainly very healing for people who have lost someone close to them. But another thing that Freyde talks about is the way in which these commemorations renew a relationship with the deceased. So he was saying the fact of the social legitimation of, in a sense, summoning the memory of the person in a collective sphere where this is viewed as not only socially intelligible, but socially fitting, enables one to focus on one's relationship with the deceased. And in that sense, it renders the person, in a certain sense, present. Again, this is to focus on the presence of the person in memory. And the fact that this is done collectively also enables one to relate in your own individual way. Casey talks about this too. He says that in one sense, a commemoration always involves something like a ritual or a text or both that are set and fixed. But there's always something that isn't completely transparent about them, meaning that their meaning isn't absolutely fixed, but instead each person can relate to what's being said and to the sense of loss and memorialization in their own personal way. And having the collective reinforcement of this by sharing the experience can be extremely powerful. Freyde describes the way in which he thinks the relationships with the deceased are renewed. So to quote him, there's a relationship, there's a streaming out to the object in which one fulfills a relational role, that of parent or child or friend, and one need not reflect on the fact that the target is an idea rather than a physical presence. I wanted to include this quotation because I think it makes it clear what he is and is not saying here. It is not that he thinks that this is like a collective seance, but he is saying that when we lose someone to death, we still have a relationship that is quite intimate and specific with the person. And that in the context of a collective memorial, our emotional going out to the person renews the fact that, in his case, he's thinking of his father as his father or his brother as his brother. And he is behaving as the counterpart in each of those relationships. And he says that this is actually a way of showing respect and love because these are actual gestures of respect and love. And so the power of this kind of memory is really strong in the sense that we do find ourselves really feeling the connection with the deceased person as the person that we are honoring. The last kind of memorialization that I want, or memory that I want to talk about, is what Casey calls internal memorialization. This, I think, that kind of overly dramatizes its abstract character. But I think what he has in mind here is the way in which we commemorate someone internally. And I suspect that actually when we write things like "forever in our hearts" or "we'll always remember you" on a memorial card or a tombstone, I think this is probably most deeply what people have in mind, and probably what many of these other forms of memories help to bring about. And that is a kind of internal sense of the person being with you in a certain way. Frieda talks about this in the same essay where he talks about commemorations in general. And his comment, again, I think one that I think is fairly illuminating, is one assimilates one's recollections or recreations of the lost person's mode of being and way of viewing things and adds them to one's repertoire. The idea here is when we have this seeing the person in one's mind's eye, what one does is actually see the person in the way they comported themselves in the world. I think actually this is one of the reasons that photographs can be so moving to us after the loss of a loved one. We not only see, once again, what the person looked like, but actually kind of the way they held themselves and related to the world. I mean, were they enthusiastic? Were they shy? Did they bring themselves forward? Did they hold themselves back? And all of that helps us, again, to see them very clearly. Frieda is saying that when we think about the person, we also think about the way they did things, the kinds of ways they would view things. And while he was talking primarily about this reminding ourselves of the person through commemorations, there's also a sense in which we do this having internalized a sense of them in ourselves. That is, we have a sense of how they would behave, what they might think of a situation in which we find ourselves. And that becomes part of what we relate to when we are operating in the world on our own. This is one way in which we draw sustenance from the relationship that we've had with the person up to that point. And we also find ourselves doing things in a manner that is at least informed by the way they did things. This aspect continues that kind of intimacy that I was suggesting before we can frequently become aware of. Others, too, have pointed out the way in which this kind of internalization of memory works. And many psychologists see this as a very positive thing in the sense of someone coming to grips with a loss in a way that enables them to go forward. Psychiatrist and philosopher Thomas Fuchs, for example, talks about how frequently in bereavement people have a very strong feeling at first that they just don't want to go forward. If the other person isn't part of the living world, they don't really want any part of it. They almost feel that if they stay in the present moment, they're staying with the loved one who isn't going forward in time. And this might be one of the reasons why people often like to preserve, for example, the room of someone, if it's a family member, just as it was when the person was alive. the idea of having some kind of external memorialization that you can kind of go to and focus on, or even the treatment of photographs early on. In one sense, it's almost like an ersatz presence of the person, but it also can be a way of not wanting to flow on with the rest of the social world as time goes forward. Fuchs points out that if one can come to the point where you feel a kind of internal relationship with the person, as if the person is a kind of inner comforting guide or presence, that sense of impasse can be overcome. I mean, it's certainly not that one is betraying the person by going forward, but at first one might feel that way. And so to recognize the way in which one's own way of dealing with the world is informed by the person, and the person in some way continues through memory to offer guidance, or even, in a sense, reactions to the way things are in the world, that makes it possible to envision yourself going forward without feeling that you're moving on or away from the deceased, that you're failing the person in memory. Lena Rydberg-Ingerslev is another philosopher who has commented on, I think, this phenomenon. She describes the ideal in sort of the processing of grief is to come to feel in the company of the person in their absence, which sounds ironic, but she compares this to the way in which young children learn to have a feeling that they are carried in an affective relationship by their caregiver, even when the caregiver isn't there in the room. And so Ingerslev's notion is that the kind of memory we have is that this affective connection remains, and we don't really have to see the person all the time in order to trust and have confidence in that relationship. I think that this way of remembering is perhaps in the fullest sense a means of honoring the dead in memory, partly because it takes the relationship into account, not just as something that was part of your life, but something that is part of your life. So it's active in the present and still involves a kind of consideration of the person as one goes forward. It can, of course, involve a lot of these other kinds of memories. It can involve reminiscences at times, reminders of the person, and certainly recognitions of the way a person did things. But in that, people often talk about memories being a blessing. I think perhaps this is the most complete way of making memory a blessing, because it carries one forward. And insofar as we want to honor the deceased with our memories, I think this is probably the most effective way to do that. So optimal, though not something immediate. Still to have this in mind as what can grow out of grief, I think is a useful place to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As a society, we tend to, when we go to funeral services, hear the person that's deceased being talked about in a very positive way, how they are on the good days, not very much about how they're on the bad days. Do you have a view about how we should cover those things off to give a sort of a proper colouring to that person as opposed to a more positive view?
Yeah, I've certainly read an article talking about how obituaries have changed over time, so that the tone of present-day obituaries is aiming at more of a balanced coverage than used to be the case. I think I think I would compare the idea of forgiving and forgetting to the sense of speaking well of the dead. I mean, I think the idea of speaking well of the dead in part seems only fair because they're not here to defend themselves. I think that might be an aspect of it. But I think there might be a kind of collective wisdom in thinking that it is good not to fixate on the negativity, but to carry forward what one can find positive in the relationship. Now, this is not to say that there aren't relationships that are terribly problematic, and I do think that that can be the case in individual relationships, and maybe sometimes that needs to be addressed therapeutically. But I think you're talking more generally about the idea of, whether talking about the dead we should, I mean, there's another, I guess, another way to put this. I think there are what can be viewed as flaws in a person that when they die, whatever the flaw, whatever might be negative about the flaw isn't something that is really in effect anymore. Like if someone kept you waiting frequently, that could be very annoying while they're alive, whereas when they're dead, it's just kind of an eccentricity, that isn't really going to be much of a bother in the future. I mean, I don't think it's really to say something that's necessarily praiseworthy to say someone tended to slow one down when you were trying to go somewhere. But it's not the kind of thing that people are going to say, that's really a blight on the person's memory.
Yes, thank you. That was an extremely helpful presentation. I'm a humanist involved deeply in pastoral support, including funeral work. So having to deal in situations where I'm not offering a religious afterlife response to remembering and keeping alive, being alive. So this is very much the line we would take. But I'm always very conscious when I'm talking. There are lots of things I don't know about the person and their relationships. And I'm just slightly nervous sometimes that I'm on about how our memories are very helpful in keeping people present, might be very traumatic if some of those memories have been very destructive for that relationship. Can you just comment on that?
Yeah, no, I think you're completely right about that. I mean, they're traumatic memories, and those are not the kind of things that one wants to keep alive. I obviously on a case-by-case basis would be my comment to that. I'm talking generally about relationships where there was a fairly good and constructive and supportive relationship between two people. But of course, real life is more complicated than the kind of ideal circumstances I'm describing.
Do you think that grief and the types of memory that you've talked about are applicable to people that we don't have a personal relationship with, like celebrities or world leaders? I feel like a lot of people grieve even though they've never met them or had a personal relationship with. So is that considered the same sort of grief and memory process?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, yes. But I mean, I guess partly it would depend a little bit on what people do have in their mind when they, people can have a very active characterization of a celebrity in their mind, even though they've never met the person. And it can be a little bit like fictional characters that are really important to us. So people do have major responses to Anna Karenina and those kind of emotional responses to the fate of fictional characters and the fate of celebrities, I think, are kind of analogous in that there's something that the story is really meaningful to us, and we see it as a kind of trajectory of a person's life, even though we don't have any kind of direct interaction with them. So I think it can be, but some kinds of things maybe are going to be somewhat different. For example, seeing the person in one's mind's eye, it's possible, I suppose, to envision a person in a certain way and be reminded of that by some person you encounter in daily life, or be reminded of that person's story by something else that occurs. But I think it wouldn't have the same detail or specificity of interaction with the person's character that you would expect from someone you know. But I think those are interesting cases.
Yeah, I was curious in listening, not to every point, but whether you've applied some of these lenses to loss outside of death. So even a period of life that was particularly enjoyable or fulfilling, or a relationship that ends unwillingly.
Yeah. I have thought about them. I haven't, sort of like gone through and thought about how each of these kinds of memories would be involved. And I think in some cases it depends on how. I mean, grief usually involves something that you think you can't revive. So something has been lost and it's not going to come back, and that may be the case in a certain relationship, but there's a little bit more wiggle room for the possibility of a different outcome or revival of a romantic relationship, say. The loss of a job can certainly cause grief, and probably it depends on where you are in a life cycle and many variables, how absolute that seems to be. I think there are going to be a lot of features of these different kinds of losses that vary. So sometimes the communal dimension of recognizing loss with other people when we're talking about death is something where society can be quite supportive, or it might not. I mean, there are other contexts where it doesn't see an individual as having the right to grieve, and that can be particularly destructive. But I think in the case of these other kinds of loss, there's less of a clear sense of society coming together to support people through it. And I think, I'm not sure memory is exactly the way I would go about thinking through those features, but I think you're asking a really important question.
Thank you for all the wonderful reflections you've shared. I was going to ask a stronger version of an earlier question, where much of what you've shared assumes a positive relationship with the deceased. But what if the main thing that we've been left with from the person who's died is some great harm or some trauma or some kind of really negative thing that they've left behind? Would you have any advice or thoughts on how to?
Yeah,
how to contend with
I mean, I guess part of it would be separating what if anything is positive from a relationship. I mean, I think in some ways it might even be easier if a relationship was completely negative, because then, like absolute, I don't mourn for the person, like that might be an easier emotional move to make than what unfortunately can be very complicated relationships where you might feel it was a very destructive relationship, but he was my father. And those, I think it's very difficult to tease apart what's positive and what's negative. But I gather from what I've read therapists suggesting that trying to ascertain what is positive that one does feel the connection in relation to is something important, and figuring out how to dissociate with or disentangle oneself from the negativity of that is really important. Again, I don't know that I think memory alone is going to do it, but perhaps having a sense of what memories are destructive and best to try to put securely in the past, and which ones to keep part of your active relational sense of things going forward, I think maybe would be a way of relating memory to it.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. I'd like to hear your thoughts on guilt, because many times, either if we are talking about a literal death or what was asked before of a death that could be a lost childhood, where usually as a response would be loss of memory. So in all these aspects of literal and metaphorical deaths of people who may still be alive, but they may not be in our lives, or parts of our lives that are lost and we don't remember, and the guilt also for a loved one who actually died, but feels maybe as unfinished business, in quotation, that there are things that we could have done differently, and also that this guilt might also be non-realistic. It would be a guilt that has been implanted through different aspects. Thank you.
Right, yeah. I think there are a lot of unrealistic kinds of guilt that lots and lots of people feel in relation to a loss, if only because the person died and it was somebody that you cared about, and if you were in any close relationship to them, I think there can often be a sense that you feel you should have been able to do something and weren't able to. I mean, I think that that's common, and it's desirable to overcome the unrealism of that. And I think part of doing that is to recognize that just because you couldn't prevent the loss doesn't mean that you let the person down in a way. But then there are somewhat realistic regrets that people have. And I suppose one possible way of connecting that with memory and going forward with memory is somehow trying to take what's positive from the relationship with the person and feed that into your way of approaching the world in the future. I think that can sometimes be a valuable way of moving forward. Because I think what you're often, I mean, the various things you're talking about involve a kind of getting stuck somewhere. And I think that a lot of ways that memories seem to betray us is they get us stuck in the past or in some interpretation of the past that isn't productive and kind of repeats itself over and over again because one can't do something with it. So I think that some of the ways that addressing memories that are more constructive can help us as we go forward might be applied in these cases too. Though again, I don't doubt that there are cases where therapeutic intervention is helpful.
You mentioned like the memory is kind of like affective connection with the person or event. So I was really inspired by that, and also I was thinking, is that useful to draw that affective connection through maybe draw that person's portrait or keep talking about it? Do you think it's actually useful to working with those absent body, or this thing that already gone? But do you think it's worth to keep drawing about this affective connection?
I think it certainly can be. Do you mean like literally drawing a person?
Yeah, like drawing about what they look like, or write about it, write diary about it, or.
Yes, I mean, I think those can be, I mean, they can both amplify memory and reinforce it in certain ways. And in some ways, they can also be celebrations of the person's life. I mean, I think that memory sometimes does seem to have this kind of, well, in some ways, the kinds of thing I was just talking with you about, the inertia of memory it seems that it's something that we don't have a lot of control over, and it's something that we carry around with us or carry around with regret, or even if they're happy memories, they're over. And I think ways of moving into the future with what one remembers and wants to continue to keep alive in some way is all to the good.
Sort of a related question. How do you think the 6 kinds of memory would apply writing about the person as your art? Like if you're actually maybe publishing a book about the person, how would the 6 types of memory apply then?
Well, I think they would apply in different ways. Like if you're writing a book with the idea of making the readers enjoy it, I mean, you might start with some immersion into the time, so the kind of reminiscences of things. If it's like a biography, that would be one kind of book. Another would be where the person shows up as a character, and that might allow for more different kinds of memory or different kinds of encounter with the person. And are you talking about a book where this is a book about someone who has died? And yeah.
So I'm wondering how this can be used as a tool.
Right. I don't think I would suggest this as kind of like something that you would want necessarily to get all of these kinds of memory in. I mean, in some ways, writing the book itself is trying to create a kind of collective memorial of sorts. And perhaps if people who read it knew the person, I mean, and that, like for some people that would be more likely than others, then it would enable them to recollect the person in their mind's eye. But I suppose what one would be wanting to do is give the impression that people had actually known the person, even if they hadn't. So I would think that the idea of seeing the person in one's mind's eye is maybe what you're aiming to do. And to do that, it would be things like their mode of behavior and their stance to the world that you try to bring across in what you would present. So I do think a lot of these ideas would carry over, but probably you wouldn't be focusing on it so much as memory as such in the book, but more immediately being there in the room where the person is doing the various things you're talking about. Interesting idea.
Really great talk, thank you. You've discussed a number of elements which other people have asked about regarding the complexity of relationships, and there's not always a positive or a negative, it's somewhere in the middle. I wondered what degree you consider authenticity to be important in this production of a memory or a collection of moments which you can carry with you productively, you mentioned in the present, that they can be of benefit to you. Is it important to create an authentic image of that memory, or can one helpfully shape what one chooses to bring into the present for the rest of their waking life around the things they want to keep and discard some things that maybe were real that they don't want to keep anymore? Or does that have an effect?
Yeah, I think the interpretation of memory is always going to be a factor. I don't think it means that one doesn't have authentic memories, but I think there might be different ways of discarding what isn't useful to you any longer. I mean, there's discarding, like pretending it never happened or trying to create an artificial amnesia. That doesn't strike me as probably as likely to work for even for what you want it to do, or probably as beneficial as integrating the memories into something that is workable going forward. But I think we're always making assessments of what another person, what the kinds of things another person does and what those things show us about their character. And it may be in some cases that one has a relationship with someone whose character one really decides has really had a very toxic effect on one's life. And that's how you want to understand anything about the person. I think a lot of times it's much more complicated than that, but still I think that one can have some accuracy in memory, to lacking a better word for it. Authenticity, I guess, is probably closer to it. Some authenticity in memory, and still make a decision about what to keep as active. I kind of mentioned forgiving and forgetting, and I think what people mean by that is not really that they don't remember things, but the memories aren't really active in their behavior any longer. Like, yes, I can remember, like something that someone did that was a slight, and I'm just going to take that out of play. That's not what I'm going to carry forward. I think there must be some analogous way of dealing with some of these memories.
More like curation. You're picking,
yes,
and you can put to one side, but you don't delude or deny or ignore.
Yeah.
I guess my question has two parts. So the first part of my question is, do you think that there are healthy and unhealthy ways of processing grief? Like, what's your personal view on that? And I guess the second, more specific part of my question is, assuming that artificial intelligence is advanced enough and we can potentially give it data on our deceased loved one, like enough data that it can generate interactions that would be similar to what we did experience with our deceased loved one. Do you think that that's a healthy way of remembering a deceased loved one, or sort of having their schema with us?
Right. I don't have any strong views about healthy grief. I do think that some people get fixated or kind of have difficulty processing to the point that without some intervention from someone, which may or may not be an official therapist, but that they're going to stay in a very unhappy state. So insofar as we have to talk about it in terms of health, I would think, I don't care to label that unhealthy or a medical problem necessarily, but I think people can need some help. With regard to chatbots, I think some people have suggested that there is a danger of those taking attention away from the real person, or kind of covering it over, a little bit like what Lewis was saying. He was afraid his own attitudes and impressions of his wife were going to do to his memory. The chatbot's a little bit different. Well, maybe not so different as I think, but I think it's different in the sense that chatbots, I don't know how many of you have heard of these, maybe everybody, but I was really surprised when I first heard about them. But some people have made artificial intelligence images, well, maybe almost like holograms. I don't know exactly what form they come in, but they behave and sound and maybe look like the person who has died. And because a lot of information about what the person actually said and did and wrote has been fed to the AI, it can sound pretty convincing. I don't know that I think it would be ideal if everyone kind of moved along to the chatbot to relate to and stopped relating to the person that they remember. Whether this can be a plausible way of remembering a person like a photograph, I don't know. I guess the danger would be that the immediacy of these made-up things that the person never did say being, very present to you, for some people might end up taking on a kind of unfortunate importance and end up diverting whatever kind of constructive attention might be paid to the actual person.
But you don't think it's particularly unhealthy?
I think I would think that this would depend a lot on how a person was using it. Just as I do a photograph, I suppose one could have a unhealthy focus or fixation on a particular photograph, but a lot of people use photographs of their deceased loved ones and feel comforted by them, feel that it's connected to the person. I guess the connection in this case seems more distant from the person, but there might be some healthy ways to use it, I don't know.
You mentioned in terms of physical memorialization that can be ineffective in terms of remaining those, how even a physical monument is not as effective as something as liquid as memory, and how as time passes that we sort of forget our loved ones, and how even the portraits become as drab as the walls they are placed on. You mentioned in passing that actually the best types of physical memorialization are the ones that are unexpected. Could you give examples of such physical aspects? And is it something that one should pursue instead? Or perhaps the physical memorials?
Yeah, I mean, how to pursue, something attracting one's attention is a real challenge. I think that, I'm thinking of things more like coming across an old photo that one hadn't expected, but having things placed, in prominent positions in one's home is not a good way of seeing them if they stay in the same place. I suppose you could move pictures around from time to time. I mean, that has some effect of drawing our attention to them. But I think the kinds of things that are more immediate are often like the recognition of the nephew's comment about his grandmother. Like, they're not expected, and so it's a little bit hard to arrange for them being there. Maybe talking with people sometimes will bring this up, like getting together with relatives and friends. That can have that effect, but I think it's hard to contrive being surprised by yourself.
So, would you perhaps de-emphasize the physical aspect and rather pursue sort of social interaction instead of remembering them?
Well, no, not necessarily. I mean, I think that there can be visual artworks, for instance. You can rearrange things. I mean, I think a lot of them are just, if it's a matter of keeping the furniture in the same position, that's going to a lot of effort for probably minimal returns. But I think there can be physical things that can remind you of a person. It's just if they're in the same place every day, they're probably not going to do much in that connection. I suppose you could go to places where you remember being with the person. I think that can be very evocative for people sometimes. So, I mean, I don't have anything against there being physical memorialization of that sort. I just think it's a little unreliable.
Can I ask about the memory of touch?
Yeah.
Because, you seem to be able to keep hold of so much now. How somebody spoke, how they, videos and everything else. But touch is such an intimate part of our relationship with people. And yet, as soon as the person dies, you'll never have that touch again. And trying to keep a memory of that feels impossible.
Yeah, it does. And I think that's one of the reasons that clothing is so commonly pursued as a vehicle. Did you have more to say?
No, yeah. It's just is there anything you can do? But you say, clothing, and is there anything you can do to try and keep hold of that memory? And is there anything being sort of written about that?
Yeah, there is a little bit written about that, but it tends to be more not just touch, but the whole sensorium. So, yeah, having various kinds of impacts on the senses. I mean, I don't think the focus so much is on recreating the sense of touch, but one thing that is a little bit similar is the impact of music, which I'm quite interested in, because I think a lot of times we do use music to recall the dead. I mean, we also are lucky to live in an age where there are recordings of music by the dead, but there's a tactile sense of music as well. And I think it's not at all uncommon to hear music that you had heard with the person and have that kind of shared sense of immediacy. I mean, that can kind of recreate the intimacy of touch. But of course, you're right, in a really literal sense, you're not going to probably be able to do that.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
I wanted to ask if you could say a little bit about memory and the connection to our own deaths in terms of us possibly being towards death, and the point that the memories of those who die, those memories die with our deaths as well. That was one point. And then a second point was thinking about deaths which are difficult deaths, and whether there's a sort of like an honor in terms of actually, the term "never forget" came to mind, and actually kind of that importance about keeping those traumatic memories alive as well.
Yes, yeah. No, I think it's difficult. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I was mentioning the way in which sometimes if one was close to someone when they died, it's very hard to escape those memories. And sometimes I think it can be helpful to reflect on other memories as well, so that the occasion of seeing the person in one's mind's eye as alive and vivid and sharing those memories can be really helpful. But there is a lot of danger to that, and I don't know that traumatic memory is just easy to supplant, though I do think that sometimes it fades with time because the immediacy adds to its effectiveness at kind of overwhelming your memory circuits. But now back to the memories of your own memories being vulnerable because they will end when you end. That I think is one of the reasons why we make so much of an effort to convey our memories to other people. I mean, that's one of the reasons why people write and make art and so on, because they would like some of these things to last beyond them, or talk with other people. A man in Sweden whose dissertation I was part of the committee for, whose name is Alfred Skold, has written about intergenerational death consciousness. And I think that he is suggesting that what we ought to do more societally to be aware of is the way in which we're all sort of like vulnerably carrying memories along. And it's important to recognize that with overlapping generations, we can carry things forward or bring things forward to others or not. And actually, in some ways, that Jonathan Lear, a philosopher at the University of Chicago, has written about how civilization in some ways is this kind of process of carrying things forward from one generation to another and feeling like we're all contributing something and also preserving what's really important for those whom we think are important to remember. So I think that finding our way in thinking of ourselves as part of that process is maybe a way of coping with the fact that, yes, inevitably our own memories will die with us.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for such a rich talk. I've just been wondering throughout the discussion and throughout your talk as well, what the sort of ethical dimensions are of your view. It seems to capture very well the kind of phenomenology or experience of grief. We've already heard a few times, what some of the, how your view might brush up against certain ethical questions, whether it's about authenticity or health. And another one that I was thinking about was agency. So you talk at a number of points about the sustaining kind of a relationship. I'm not sure that's a focus of the language that you're using, but that there's a relationship that we can maintain and potentially continue to grow or construct with the dead. But what about the agency of the deceased in that process? Could we disrespect? For example, I might not want a funeral, for example, or I might not want myself to be arrayed, have a oration or something. So these kinds of considerations might, practically around grief, but also about like, oh, you just got me wrong. Like some people think, oh, there's, half the people studying Nietzsche think, there's having disagreements about what he actually thought, and maybe he just got Nietzsche wrong. So like, that's a funny example. We might just be disrespecting people, not being faithful to actually what they wanted of us to think of them and so forth.
Yeah, I think usually it's a good idea to honor their wishes as much as possible. And I think most people who want to honor deceased loved ones want to do that. Sometimes it can be impracticable. It kind of depends on what it is that they want to have done. And I suppose there may be cases where it isn't ethically absolutely clear that they should always have their way, but I think there ought to be a really compelling reason to overlook what it is that they wanted. I think that for those who need a funeral but the person is dead set against it, there might be other ways of commemorating that serve some of the same functions. So yeah, I'd look for some middle ground.
Good. Well, that brings us to time. Thank you all very much for your questions. And Kathleen, thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thanks.